There will be a point, though, where carbon cannot be designed out any further, and Healthy Waters is taking the approach that for all carbon that cannot be designed out, we need to sequester or remove an equal amount. If you just go to the next slide. So I just think it's always good to get a visual on what a ton of carbon looks like, and you'll see here that this is what 1 tonne represents. And just for an example, we will be building a pipe out in Newlyn called Clinker Place, and that's going to be emitting 800 tonnes. So that's what we're working with. Just go to the next slide. So I've been tasked with leading work to find sequestration opportunities within the Auckland region, which is finding ways at which we can remove carbon from the atmosphere. Healthy Waters has chosen to focus on blue carbon sequestration, which is the removal of carbon by oceanic and coastal ecosystems rather than terrestrial planting projects, as these ecosystems have been shown to sequester vast amounts of carbon, up to 4 times the amount of a forest. And we are working closely with the environmental engineering firm PDP on this work, and which nicely leads me to introduce our next speaker to you, Olya Albot, who's going to take us through the ins and outs of blue carbon ecosystems. Thanks, everyone.
Great. I will start sharing my screen. Thanks, Leigh.
Kia ora. Thanks, Olya, and thanks, Leigh. That was great. Great introduction.
All right, so as Leigh mentioned, I'll be talking about nature-based blue carbon solutions. And before we get into the details, let's set the scene. Why are we paying attention to blue carbon now? I'm sure most of us saw that in August last year, the IPCC published the first part of its 6th assessment, providing the most up-to-date scientific understanding of the climate system and climate change. The report noted that many records are being set, the concentration of CO2 being the highest level in at least 2 million years, when sea levels were also about 4 to 20 meters higher than present. Right now, the sea level is rising at its fastest rate in at least 3,000 years, and glaciers are retreating at a rate unprecedented in at least 2,000 years. So this report paints a really grim picture of the future, and even with such a clear message that there is very little time to act, most countries have still failed to set ambitious emission reduction targets. And this figure shows CO2 concentrations across 5 pathways used in the current IPCC analysis. So these range from very low to intermediate, high, and very high. Alarmingly, the world's current policies put us on track for warming of between 2.2 and 3.5 degrees within 80 years. So those are the 2 top emission scenarios. It's far better than the 4 degrees or more feared about a decade ago, but still far from consistent with the Paris Agreement. And to keep warming to 1.5 degrees by century's end, global CO2 emissions must halve in a decade by 2030, reach net zero in the 2050s, and go net negative thereafter compared to pre-industrial times. With increasing climate change impacts and human activity, the United Nations estimates that 66% of the marine environment has been significantly altered. But nature-based solutions in the marine environment, such as coastal wetland restoration and preservation, can play an important role in carbon abatement, as well as coastal resilience and biodiversity conservation efforts worldwide, while providing social and economic benefits. So established blue carbon solutions currently offer emission reductions of 0.4 to 1.2 gigatons of CO2 annually, which is roughly 1 to 3% of total annual CO2 emissions. But if scaled up with emerging solutions, such as large-scale seaweed farming and bottom trawling management, This could account for up to 7% of total annual CO2 emissions. It's still a tiny part of the reduction targets, but given the multitude of additional ecosystem services, these solutions are at the forefront of climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies. So blue carbon solutions for climate mitigation and adaptation are mentioned in more than half of climate pledges made by governments. So those ones that have signed onto the Paris Agreement target. And in Aotearoa, New Zealand, blue carbon has been recognized as an important nature-based solution, but more research is needed at a local level to understand the role that blue carbon can play in future climate change policy. So preservation and restoration of coastal wetlands for carbon sequestration is an established nature-based blue carbon solution. So let's talk a bit more about this. Coastal wetlands can be broken down into 3 environments: mangroves, salt marshes, and seagrasses. And collectively, they're referred to as blue carbon ecosystems. They provide a natural way of reducing the impact of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere through the sequestration or taking in of carbon. Mangroves and salt marshes remove carbon from the atmosphere at a rate 10 times greater than tropical forests. Seagrass meadows account just for 0.1% of the world's seafloor, but store 11% of the organic carbon buried in the ocean. So why are these ecosystems so efficient at trapping carbon? A crucial element is the wet, low oxygen and the high salinity of soils that slow the decay of plant and other organic material. When the plants die, the carbon in the decaying organic matter becomes buried and locked in the soil, so it's sequestered into the soil. Also, the rapid burial rates of the decomposing plant matter and other sediments that the wetland plants trap has enabled these ecosystems to accrete vertically and effectively keep pace with relative sea level rise so far. And this means that healthy coastal wetlands can keep that carbon stored away for millennia, providing a natural way to prevent it from being released back into the atmosphere. It's also important to note that coastal wetlands emit greenhouse gases as well, such as CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide. Although these emissions are supposedly negligible because that organic matter is well preserved when it's buried, limiting the production of these greenhouse gases. But there are no existing measurements of the emission profiles for coastal wetlands in New Zealand or comprehensive sequestration measurements yet. Despite their recognized importance in climate mitigation and adaptation efforts, coastal wetlands rank among the most threatened habitats on Earth. Blue carbon ecosystems have lost an estimated 35% of their global cover just since 1970. And in Aotearoa, 90% of freshwater and coastal wetlands have been drained either for agricultural use or coastal development. When these ecosystems degrade, either through human interference or through natural disasters like cyclones, and in the longer term sea level rise, those vast stores of carbon are released in the form of 3 major greenhouse gases: CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide, contributing to further greenhouse gas increases and accelerating climate change. And given that in large parts of Aotearoa, sea level is expected to rise over 1 meter by the end of the century, how effective would implementing blue carbon solutions be in the long term? And this is very important to understand when we're trying to quantify carbon stocks and sequestration rates. What will sea level rise do to the permanence of these carbon stocks? There is research suggesting that coastal wetlands capture more carbon as sea level rises, but there are also studies indicating that if sea level rises too quickly, coastal wetlands will not be able to keep up their vertical accretion and will be drowned, effectively releasing the blue carbon stocks back into the atmosphere. So further research is needed to improve our understanding of the adaptation mechanisms of coastal wetlands to sea level rise, particularly their ability to migrate inland. Also, recent studies indicate that nitrate runoff has a potentially significant impact on the ability of the soil to sequester carbon. Basically, the nitrates change the soil chemistry and promote microbial activity that breaks down the organic material, releasing greenhouse gases in the process. So how significant is this impact in New Zealand? But there is good news. It's not all negative. We've got a lot of research to do, but let's have a look what others around the world are doing. In the past decade, there's been a flurry of climate commitments to protect and restore coastal wetlands. Seychelles is one of several countries assessing the role the blue carbon ecosystems can play in meeting its goals established in the Paris Agreement. In particular, this island nation has committed to protecting 50% of its seagrass and mangrove habitats by 2025 and 100% by 2030. Seychelles is now advancing this research, which is a collaboration between scientists, industry, government, and NGOs to deliver on this ambitious commitment. In the USA, since 2017, the EPA has included coastal wetlands in its annual inventory of US greenhouse gas emissions and sinks. And to help create stronger connections among state agencies, practitioners, researchers, and NGOs working in the space, a national blue carbon network has also recently been launched. In Australia, the first emission reduction fund for blue carbon project was established in 2022, so just earlier this year. And this fund details the first method for calculating the amount of carbon that could be sequestered when tidal zones are returned to their natural states. So for coastal farmland that's regularly inundated and does not provide any grazing profit, this fund enables farmers to gain credits from restoration projects. And here at home in Aotearoa, New Zealand, there are a few preliminary studies, and this research is taking off with a handful of projects looking into this. NIWA, the Nature Conservancy, an awesome community-led initiative by the Tasman Environmental Trust, Auckland Council, a collaboration between Victoria University, DOC, and then Zesira's program, which is providing funding for my PhD research. But in saying that, there is a lack of a national direction in this research area. Saying more research needs to be done isn't exactly providing a national strategy and a streamlining mechanism. So imagine the benefits for researchers, government, and industry if a national blue carbon network is established at the very beginning of this research journey. So how would one go about collecting data for a blue carbon project with the objective of, say, registering it with a voluntary blue carbon credit scheme? So data collection is key, including for both below ground and above ground carbon stocks. So that means both soil and vegetation. For below ground measurements, we need to collect sediment cores and analyze these for organic carbon content and date the sediments to quantify the rates at which the carbon is being sequestered. We also need to determine where the carbon that we're quantifying originates. Is it marine or terrestrial in source? And this is important because we don't want to incorporate the organic carbon that's been derived outside of the study site, say in a terrestrial environment, but ends up being transported to the wetland. It's also worth mentioning that to quantify the net sequestration potential, so whether the site is overall a source or a sink of carbon, it's essential to measure greenhouse gas fluxes to understand how much CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide is being released versus sequestered at the sites. For above ground carbon stock measurements, remote sensing and machine learning is really starting to be widely utilized in research and industry. And of course, we need to model the impact of sea level rise on these ecosystems. And this should ideally consider changes in organic and mineral sedimentation rates, changes in plant biomass, and sediment delivery to site. So this is just a very quick overview of how you go about collecting this data. I also want to emphasize that coastal wetlands present a key advantage by supplying multiple ecosystem services in addition to carbon sequestration. Coastal ecosystems provide food and refuge for marine life, they provide coastal protection, and they underpin the cultural heritage and food sovereignty of coastal indigenous peoples worldwide. So this really illustrates that we must have a holistic approach when talking about protection and restoration of our coastal wetlands for climate mitigation and adaptation. And in Aotearoa, this needs to be done in close collaboration with Māori, who have sustainably looked after these ecosystems for hundreds of years. So to conclude, to fully take advantage of our blue carbon ecosystems, we must invest in the protection and restoration of these habitats. We need local case studies to understand the net sequestration potential using consistent methodologies and very close collaboration between various agencies. We need to understand how these ecosystems are changing with land use pressures and climate change impacts, as there is considerable risk that the removals achieved through the sequestration will be reversed over time through land management decisions or natural disturbances. And that means we need to establish resilience building strategies. And this is really a great opportunity for researchers, government, industry, NGOs, local communities, and iwi to partner on these projects. And the Nature Conservancy are doing just that. So with that, I will pass it over to Erik.
Kia ora, thanks so much, Olya. That was awesome and some really great info there. And yeah, pass along to Erik.
Thanks very much, Olya and Ayla. Yeah, awesome to have that that primer around blue carbon as a lead into this. So really today, I'm just going to give you a bit of an overview. Firstly, around TNC. It's an organisation that some of you may not have heard about before. So I'll just talk briefly about who we are and what we do, particularly with our focus in New Zealand. And then I'll just sort of build on what Olya was saying around some of those opportunities for collaboration and partnership in this blue carbon space. We have a real interest in seeing this develop as it's a really critical step at the nexus between the climate change and biodiversity crises. So hopefully you can all see my screen okay. So with any luck, that will progress. It's not. Oh, here we go. It works. So yeah, firstly, so the Nature Conservancy. So we've been around for a little while now. We're one of the largest conservation NGOs in the world. Founded in 1951 with a real focus around science and science-led interventions. Very big presence in the US, where we have over 1 million members, but globally we've got about 4,000 plus staff members and growing, operating in about 72 different countries and territories across the world. Reasonably new into New Zealand, so we've been here for about 5 or 6 years now, with a team of about 16, and steadily adding to that as we develop our portfolios. But we operate as one conservancy. While we all have business units around the world, we all pitch together and look to cooperate on some of these big cross-cutting issues like blue carbon. I think it's really a good example of leveraging off our global networks. As I say before, our origins and as a science-based organisation means that we are very, very evidence-based. So we're looking to leverage off scientific findings. We're non-confrontational. You won't see us in the media bagging anybody. We look to partner with a whole with a wide range of stakeholders, and with a focus around the coalition of the willing. So a lot of our work is done in collaborative partnerships. It's very rare that we would have projects where we go alone. But we have a real pragmatism to what we do, and ultimately with a focus around tangible and lasting results at scale. To give you just a bit of a taste, I suppose, of some of the ambition for the organisation at a global scale, we're looking to kind of contribute towards projects that might sequester in the order of about 3 gigatons of carbon per annum by 2030. So we're really excited to work in systems like blue carbon, where there's huge potential for scale. So just touching on the New Zealand program specifically, then So we've got work that occurs up in the Auckland region, so in the Hauriki Gulf, where our focus is around shellfish restoration, but we look to expand the range of initiatives that we're involved in up there over time. We're in the early stages of a Waikato payment for ecosystem services approach, and it's looking to develop, I guess, innovative funding tools to kind of help achieve the vision for restoration in the Waikato catchment. The Hawke's Bay Impact Investment is partnering with the regional council there and looking at how we can kind of incentivise carbon and forestation projects alongside regenerative agriculture. Looking to pilot with about 50 farms initially, but if it's successful, this impact investment might scale up to about $500 million worth of investment across the Hawke's Bay region and possibly across the rest of the country with some major environmental benefits. The Ko Teitanga Multi-Tie Alliance is a partnership involving 8 iwi and 5 councils and Department of Conservation at the top of the South Island, which we provide, I guess, a brokering and coordination function with a vision for achieving restoration across 3.5 million hectares of land, fresh water and oceans. So we're super excited about bringing a range of our tools to bear on that one. We also have a land purchase function. It's a big thing for us overseas, and we're just dipping our toes in the water here in New Zealand. Conservation Leaders is a capability development program where we're looking to train up a whole range of organisations and individuals in iwi around landscape scale conservation planning work. So that's a really collaborative process leveraging off of the open conservation standards. So that's something we're super excited about, building that capability to be able to kind of achieve planning and ambition at scale. And then lastly, blue carbon, as Olya was touching on, we're very interested in supporting and building on the excellent work of Olya, the Tasman Environment Trust, NIWA, Auckland Council and others who are operating in this space, to kind of really see what we can kind of bring to the party to help create a viable market and essentially a way of funding this critically important restoration work that needs to happen in these coastal communities. Because we believe there's some very significant win-wins here around carbon sequestration and biodiversity enhancement. Just to say that this work that we're doing here in New Zealand is part of a broader suite of blue carbon projects that we're involved in. Most of them are mangrove focused. I suppose it's a fairly typical pattern around the world, although we've got quite a large seagrass project that's just come to the market, created the first blue carbon credits for TNC just recently in the Virginia coast. And New Zealand is a nice complement to this kind of suite of projects because we've got a real strong focus on seagrass, which a number of the other ones don't. I should say that TNC is also heavily involved in the Australian blue carbon program as well. So our New Zealand blue carbon program has 4 main sort of facets to it. The first is a pre-feasibility assessment, and so that's work that we just recently commissioned and completed, which I'll talk about in a second, which kind of really just asks those kind of high-level questions around will this approach fly in New Zealand in the New Zealand context? And the good news is yes, but there's a few caveats around that. We're also mapping restoration potential for these blue carbon sites with a particular focus around salt marsh restoration. And so that's using some of our global expertise around modelling work and GIS management to identify which areas might be well suited to the sort of restoration work and to help us ascertain the kind of size of the prize in New Zealand. Building the evidence base is really that kind of one of the issues that Olya touched on. Really, we don't have a lot of data in New Zealand for the sequestration rates and the longevity of the carbon or the permanence of that carbon in New Zealand systems, and so we're really keen to kind of support the work to kind of build that evidence base over time. But lastly, it's for us that our main priority is these pilot projects and actually taking project sites and running them right through doing the analysis that Olya outlined earlier, but working through these voluntary carbon methodologies. We will work with a Vera standard VM33 for tidal salt marsh and seagrass to actually demonstrate how project proponents can actually set up a blue carbon project, create credits and market those credits as a demonstrator for others to get on board, hopefully. So I'll just talk through a little bit more length of each one of these. So the pre-feasibility assessment that we just completed has kind of 4 main dimensions of feasibility. One's technical. So there's obviously quite a lot in this part. It's quite a technical undertaking to understand what's happening in these systems and how the carbon is being sequestered, the rate at which it's being sequestered, and whether or not by creating projects you're creating issues around leakage and additionality. Financial is another big component to this, having some understanding around the potential kind of returns for carbon credits, but also the range of costs associated with restoring these systems. In some cases, it might result in earthworks for removing kind of bunds or drainage networks. In a lot of cases, it will involve direct restoration planting. But the other thing to consider is also the opportunity costs. And so if you're displacing other land uses, what are the values associated with grazing, for instance, and those areas and those things that you'd be displacing, and that needs to be put into the mix in order to inform whether or not projects are financially viable. Legal, obviously, we need to kind of understand the particulars of the New Zealand kind of judicial system and the legal framework and how that might impact. Obviously, there's some significant complexity in around that Marine and Coastal Areas Act, around who has control and authority to generate credits in those spaces. And then lastly, organisational. That's really just understanding the kind of how you might structure and implement sort of large carbon projects, especially if you wanted to go to scale. And so the take home, I suppose, from this, and I will say that we've got a presentation on this on the 16th, I think that's next week, where the authors of this assessment will talk in some more detail about the main findings, which I can maybe share a link at the end. If you have an interest in attending that, you're more than welcome. But the headline is, yes, we believe these sorts of projects are feasible in New Zealand. The low-hanging fruit is probably going to be salt marsh restoration in areas that have been previously reclaimed from estuaries, and so those areas which were bunded off, say floodgates were installed in that area which was formerly salt marsh was converted into grazing land. So we think those ones provide the kind of the easiest opportunity, and those are the ones that we're pursuing for our mapping and our pilot projects. But there's also a number of recommendations here around what information gets we need to plug for seagrass restoration, but also we think we need to kind of explore the opportunities for enhancing sequestration within mangrove systems as well. So that's something for us to follow up. But by and large, the answer was yes, go ahead, get stuck into the pilots. And so that's what we're focusing on now. Just touching on the mapping briefly, so there are a number of others who are kind of doing this work as well. Future Coast Aotearoa, led by Niwa and others, will be doing some quite comprehensive mapping around the country. We're sort of dipping our toes in the water and have a beta version of this, of some early testing of potential restoration sites, largely leveraging off of high resolution digital elevation models and existing land cover types, coupled with then projections around sea level rise. And certainly interesting to have those recent sea rise summaries come out, so it's good timing for us. And it's helping just inform discussions around also what areas locally, and this is a screenshot of an area near where I live in the top of the south, called the Waimea Inlet. And so you can see here, well, I won't talk at length, this is a bit hard to kind of decipher what's going on this map, but the dark blue is the stuff that's currently below in high water springs. And so it's areas that have been previously reclaimed from salt marsh. And so it immediately kind of points to an area where we probably want to reach out to some landowners and start discussing opportunities for blue carbon sites. But the other nice thing about this analysis is that it can actually sort of ask some questions around, well, with the sea level rise projections, where else might be inundated in, let's say, 20, 30, 50, 100 years time, and starts to inform considerations around it. So what are those areas that are going to be most important for the migration of these habitat types over time, so that can inform our prioritisation work. And when we scale this up, so this is a beta version just for the top of the South Island at the moment, but we hope to scale up to the rest of New Zealand. Will help really inform then, alongside those estimates of sequestration rates, like the total sequestration potential for these systems. Just another way for us to kind of understand the importance of this sort of restoration activity for New Zealand's climate commitments. Yeah, so very much work in progress, but we're excited to be able to kind of start testing this with some of our partners. Building the evidence base. yeah, as Olya mentioned, the Tasman Environment Trust are doing some fantastic things in my neck of the woods, getting out there, taking sediment cores, salt marsh and seagrass and others, and really kind of building the story around, I guess, these systems as carbon sinks, but also hopefully understanding their sequestration potential and scaling that up. So we're very interested to look to see how we can kind of support and enhance and catalyse more of this work happening across the country. And so that's something for us to work on, but really the main focus, as I said, is around our pilot projects. And so, as I said, the feasibility assessment suggested that we should be focusing on those salt marsh areas previously reclaimed from estuaries, but we will be adding some mangrove sites as well, as if we can swing it. And at these sites, we're looking for quite large systems, and hopefully we can also accommodate a range of habitat types within that. So whilst the core focus might be on salt marsh, we might look at some of the marginal sort of dry land systems, fresh water if it's connected as well. So we've got an open mind about those sites. We'd love to have some representative sites, and so telling a story around the potential variability across the country, north, south, east, west. You get the picture, and we'll be doing that sort of detailed assessments, as Olya was mentioning, to understand the sequestration rates, looking at the hydrological implications of maybe removing some of that drainage infrastructure, and hopefully adding a better picture around greenhouse gas emissions in these systems, because there's some interesting things that happen in these tidal interfaces. The assessments will be against, global standards, and so I mentioned the Vera standard VM33 that we'll be using, which involves third-party validation of our methods of the actual sequestration, and then ultimately the creation of credits. And the idea here is, as I said in my intro, it's really that end-to-end. How would you start and follow through and deliver a blue carbon project? To further elucidate the kind of rates that you can expect, at least in the local context where these pilot sites will be located, but also the structuring of the financing. Do we need grant funding to make it work? Are they viable on their own? And how might you go about marketing credits? And ultimately, it would be great if others would pick up these sorts of projects and accelerate that, and we're hopeful that might occur. But I suspect there'll need to be follow-up conversations around, well, how do you scale that up to unlock, I suppose, that broader potential around the country. We haven't chosen all of the sites as yet. We're in conversations with a number of organisations and looking to kind of secure sites in the top of the south. We'd love to do some work in Auckland, in Northland, Hawke's Bay, the Waikato, Bay of Plenty, and so those conversations are ongoing. But we hope to have those locked in the next few months. I thought I'd touch on some of the financials. Some of you might be a little bit curious, I guess, just around how this sort of stacks up. I guess that all of it really does hinge on what sort of returns you can kind of expect for these sorts of projects. So internationally, at least they have been tending around that sort of $10 to $30 US per tonne of CO2. But some of the advice that we've received is that because these projects have such considerable co-benefits, so the biodiversity, the cultural, social kind of elements that come alongside it, that they're likely to attract a premium price on the voluntary market. In some cases, it's not unreasonable to expect that you could have a 20% premium perhaps on top of like an NZU spot price. And so some of these graphs are just showing, I guess all of you are probably quite familiar with the trend in the NZU price steadily going up and forecast to continue to do so in the immediate future. So we're really optimistic about the potential for the carbon pricing to really help catalyse people getting in behind these projects. But of course, a lot of this will also hinge on those specific sequestration rates that we observe in New Zealand. There have been some figures bandied around quite dramatically increased sequestration rates as compared to, let's say, terrestrial carbon systems, and we're hopeful that's the case here. Our experience in, let's say, South Australia and areas that are sort of, I guess, climatically and ecologically more similar to New Zealand suggests that maybe there's some more modest returns of 1 to 2 tonnes carbon per hectare sequestered, but we won't know until we do more of this work and really unpick what sort of rates are possible. So that's going to be a key kind of relationship between sequestration rates and those future prices for these credits in terms of just how viable these projects will be. And another important point driven home by a feasibility analysis was around the importance for economies of scale and finding ways of efficiently providing for restoration and yielding significant credits, and being able to kind of cover your project development costs across large areas is really important. So yeah, so that's just a taste of that. And I guess just lastly, I guess if some of you are wondering what you can do in this space, obviously there's a big need for funding, which is probably immediately apparent. I guess we do need more significant investment in building that evidence base and better understanding these systems. There's a lot of technical components, as I said earlier, that we really need to kind of understand, the sort of emissions profiles, the variability across the country, and building a better collective understanding of sequestration rates. It's going to be very important for us to make a case for blue carbon to be included in New Zealand national accounts, and to open up that opportunity for sort of government offsetting. So by all means, consider swinging in behind and supporting Olya and Tasman Environment Trust and others for their projects and getting in behind that. Maybe consider exploring opportunities to build your own restoration projects and have the work occur there to offset your own emissions profiles. And I guess to stay tuned as these things come on stream. We're confident that there'll be wanting buyers in a premium market there, because we do believe these sorts of credits offer something much more than just the carbon offsets. So I'll leave it there. I'm mindful I've probably gone on for a little bit longer than I anticipated, but yeah, I'll just pause there, and I guess we can have a chance to get into questions now.
Kia ora. Thank you, Eric. That was really, really interesting. And before we jump in, we have a few questions sitting there. Just want to kind of connect that into SBN and say that a lot of what you guys both and all talked about, SBN's super passionate about. We're all about that collaboration and partnering and getting all the right people together to make that change happen at pace, because we can see what sort of how quickly we need to do it at looking at some of those facts you all presented. So we have a specific nature team at SBN who's super interested in this work and has been working in the sort of regenerating and biodiversity space for a long time. But again, blue carbon's this kind of new thing that we're looking at. So at the moment, we're establishing kind of private and public partnerships to really address that issue that you brought up, Eric, about getting that funding into regenerating nature projects and how we can do that. So I will do a follow-up email to everyone afterwards, and we can include lots of links to what you guys talked about and contact details. So if you do have an interest in kind of furthering this conversation with any of us, we can address that. And we already have lots of partners really interested in this work. So it's kind of getting that, it's getting the attention it needs to kind of further it, which is really exciting. And we can see that it's kind of gaining that momentum that it needs to gain. So I'll read through some of these questions to start. There's two from Rachel Brown from SBN. They're kind of similar in the way that they're talking about. So the first one was when Olya was speaking, saying, there are a large number of community organisations restoring wetlands/waterways. Have you had a think about how we can connect with these groups nationally to share learning / develop the thinking nationally? And then she asked when Eric was speaking, sort of similar vein, that at SBN we focus on increasing the investment, and we work with lots of amazing organisations, both community, iwi, hapu, etc., who are actively restoring waterways and wetlands. Is TNC set up to share its learning across these organisations so that we're all moving in the same direction? Our aim is to provide free and open source information to help set that speed and scale for that regeneration. So they're sort of connected, if you guys want to comment on that.
Yeah, I'm happy to kick off, I guess, for the reference to TNC. Yeah, we operate in a very, very similar mode to that. And so this is why we've got this presentation on the 16th around the feasibility assessment. That's work that we funded. We want to share it, we want to build on that knowledge base and hopefully catalyse action. So we're all about bringing others into our projects to kind of help shadow in and to learn from what we're doing, for us to learn from others. And I think, Olya made a really, really good point around the opportunity for us to better align ourselves, all the actors, so that we understand, how we can best leverage off each other's capabilities and resources to drive the the greatest impact, because I think we're all kind of unified around the vision there of using this sort of mechanism to help, I guess, finance that critical kind of restoration activity and sequester important amounts of carbon. And in terms of the community, specifically around joining the dots with community groups, yeah, it's a really good point. I think that there's potentially a really useful conversation, and maybe it'll come a little bit later once we've got through some of these pilots around for maybe some of those smaller projects. They're smaller in scale. Individually, they might find it difficult to make a case for having a carbon project because they're quite substantial overheads associated with those. And maybe there's an opportunity to bundle those sites together and have some sort of organizational structure which allows them to be able to generate carbon credits from their land and share perhaps some of that costs associated with, you know, the administration of their work. So I think that's definitely something worth pursuing, because I suspect that's probably the norm really around lots of small projects, really important in their own right, but you know, we'd want them to be able to tap into this opportunity too. So it's something worth following up.
Awesome, thank you, Erik. Did you have anything to add there, Olya? No, we have other questions there.
Just very quickly, I guess, in relation to communicating this to the public. I mean, local government's already involved in this, right? And the benefit of having an established network with all types of agencies involved would be that that information trickles down to communities. And that's a good way to get it out there.
Excellent. Great. Thanks, guys. Okay. Next we have, is there a standard template for blue carbon projects, or is it bespoke for each site/scenario? What learning and insights from current projects can be translated to new projects/areas? Anyone want to jump in there?
And Erik, you can go after me if you want, fill in some gaps. There are methodologies out there to sample sites, and it is dependent on which volunteer credit scheme that you want to go with, right? So each one will have their own criteria, but there are generic sampling guides that you can use to inform that criteria. But generally speaking, it is very site specific. You have to design sampling methodologies for each site, but it's the same type of sampling at each site that you'll be doing. So it's very easy once you've done one to do that again. And obviously you do have to do a lot of risk management and consider all of that. And I think that's where Erik can jump in and fill that in.
Yeah, no, it was really good. I don't have much to add to that other than say, yeah, it's quite a lot of work in it. It's, you know, so there are very clear standards and methodologies to follow, whether, you know, you've got the resources to be able to do that and provide it. Because I mean, at the end of the day, these are high integrity credits, so you need to have a lot of evidence. You need to demonstrate that you've followed the process faithfully. So it's not an easy thing to enter into, and what, you know, I guess that's what we hope to achieve from going through the pilot process here and sharing that openly. It will demystify some of that process for people to come to understand, is this something that we can do, or do we need to outsource it, or can we club in with others, you know? So I think we really need to get these projects under our belts before we'll kind of be able to answer these questions sort of categorically. But yeah, there's a lot of work.
Yeah, thank you. That's great there. Next we have from Alex Rogers, around a time horizon. Right now I can go and offset my carbon emissions through terrestrial regeneration. When can I realistically expect to be able to do the same through marine regeneration in New Zealand? Which is, yeah, and I'll just add to that as well. Obviously that's not happening right now, but is there other ways that if you are a business that wants to be able to do that, that you can support it happening at pace?
Yeah,
well, I mean, I just sorry, yeah, I was waiting for you. Well, I think all I can speak to is the kind of the blue carbon work that we're kind of, we're not aware of anyone else kind of actively working on a blue carbon project with the aim to kind of create blue carbon credits soon. We expect what's reasonable to expect? Probably about 2023 and next year, maybe, or maybe 2024. So we're still learning, we're going through the process before the pilot projects will start generating credits. But then whether or not, how long it will take for others to come on stream to a point where the supply of those credits can satisfy the demand is another question. But it will be a little while, I imagine, before that really starts happening at scale, a few years. But of course, it's that's dependent too on the investment that comes into helping get these projects off the ground, and there is a role for philanthropy in that space, as well as government grants and other funding sources to help generate more action and bring those credits to the market a bit sooner.
I might just jump in and also say, based off previous work, like in Australia with their established emission reduction fund, to get to that point, and this is, a national scheme, right? Right now we're talking about voluntary, right? But if we want to scale up to national, for a national scheme, we need a lot of data, right? And Australia, we're collecting this for over a decade, right? And yeah, a lot of research organizations were involved, but I think the benefit we have here now is that we're at the very beginning. But if we collaborate and there's investment in this, we can very quickly scale up from voluntary, right? And there will be enough data generated to national through all of these voluntary projects that are happening.
Right, yeah. So I think as well there, especially for our network of, the majority of SBN is small to medium businesses. One of the key things there is the more we talk about it and start getting the word out, the more we can kind of get that investment and kind of action happening. So just even keeping the conversation front of mind and trying to bring it up as often as possible is a really key thing that I think people underestimate, the power of having these conversations and kind of getting it in front of people. Great. There's one here for you, Leigh. Could you please talk about how council/water agencies are now looking at blue carbon offsets? You're on mute, Leigh.
Sorry, and the office has just suddenly got very busy. How councils look at it. So it is definitely part of our strategy now to pursue options other than terrestrial planting. There is regional farms and land that can be used for planting, but also coastline, and we're particularly highlighting those areas of coastal council-owned land which has been identified as retreat in terms of sea level rise. So it's land that is no longer productive, and then that is a perfect site where we're sort of overlaying maps to work out what was previously there, whether that was a drained mangrove or seagrass or salt marsh site. So yeah, that is forefront of our agenda, is to pursue blue carbon alongside terrestrial planting.
Awesome, thanks, Leigh. And we've just got one more, which will probably take us right to time, maybe a minute over. But we have from Michaela Aspel. She says, "Kia ora, thank you for the presentation." She's one of Olya's colleagues. So nature-based solutions, including blue carbon, are mentioned as key players for action under both the emissions reductions plan and draft national adaptation plan. Can you, anyone on the panel, comment on whether you see this separation for emissions reductions versus adaptation as a prohibitor in rolling out NBS as holistic solutions for both? Anyone want to jump in on that one, Olya?
I was just going to say, I guess, to start this conversation off, and Erik and Leigh can jump in, but the fact that all of those, the emissions reduction plan and the adaptation plan, they say more research is needed, but they don't necessarily outline how these nature-based solutions will necessarily be implemented throughout the country. So there is a lot of scope to actually adjust this as we get more data on this. So for now, I don't think I can provide an answer to really, an answer to the question in a lot of detail, given how very little information we have on these ecosystems at this stage.
Do Leigh or Erik have anything to add there?
I'm just, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I 100% understood the question, but you see if the answer kind of goes to my answer. But yeah, I totally agree with Olya there. There's some real challenges in how they're going to get the most out of that funding that they've announced. But I do think, you know, it's got one of those interesting kind of solutions where there's an opportunity for sequestration and offsetting emissions, as well as adapting to kind of the impacts of climate change and sea level rise at the same time. So if these projects are successful, we can see hopefully an opportunity to support the kind of coastal migration inland of these ecosystems, and so avoiding some of the loss that might otherwise have occurred through sea level rise. We know these systems can also build sort of coastal resilience from hazards. So there could be a double whammy there around that opportunity. So in some ways, you know, so yeah, it's offsetting emissions, it's adapting to sea level rise, but it's also then addressing the biodiversity kind of losses, the historical biodiversity losses that we've experienced in those places. So I think there are some really good synergies there. Yeah, so that's just.
Yeah. Great. Thank you guys so much. That's our time for today. So thank you guys for speaking and being in this first hot take session. We're going to be doing these monthly at SBN on different topics. So we'll send out some emails with lots of exciting links to look through, and we'll make sure to include that presentation you're doing next week, Erik, for more information, and our contact details if you want to get in touch with any of us. And feel free to also suggest if there's a hot topic that you want to hear about next time. We're happy to take suggestions and get an awesome panel like this together to discuss them. So thank you everybody so much, and ka kite.
Thanks
for having me.